Now, I sometimes don't know exactly how literally to take the Bible. For example, today, Jesus says some things that are difficult to put into practice. He says, do not resist evildoers. If he strikes you on the right cheek, turn around and give him the other cheek. So what do I tell an 8th grader in our church last week who goes on his way home and some kid whacks him in the jaw, and my Lutheran friend whacked him back. But my Lutheran friend got caught, and so he got suspended. Okay, now, so how does this relate to him? Should he have turned the other cheek? I don't know, but that's a practical example. Then it says if somebody wants you to go a mile, go the second mile. Well, I think a lot of you are used to doing that. That a lot of you go the second mile for your family, for your friends, for others. But then the other one, love your neighbor. But then Jesus also says, love your enemies. Well, that ain't easy. And then pray for those who persecute you. And so I don't know what to say about that kind of stuff. I don't like to ignore it. And so I come here this morning, I go back home to check on Q, and the sun's rising. And I know I talk about it too much, but it was particularly beautiful this morning because I just caught it at the right time. And somehow in the sunrise, God speaks to you and says, relax. Somehow when you have to take Jesus' words and God's words, you have to just do the best you can, and maybe those words talk more about one person at a time. I mean, how do you stop what's happening to our kids in Chicago? How do you stop Al-Qaeda and ISIS? How do you pray and do for world peace? It's almost too big, but every one of us meets people one at a time during the week. And maybe that's what we have to be content with. But if you can love one enemy, if you can forgive one person, if you can somehow turn the cheek in some small way on somebody else, maybe that's what Jesus wants us to do. You know, I'm not much of a Facebook person. I post something once in a while. But a young lady who grew up here years ago, she's now well into her 40s, she Facebooked a sermon that I gave about her father in 1990. And the title of the sermon was Joe. I'm not sure how it is with you, but there are certain names that conjure up images. Like if you go to a church function and say, hey, Joe, about 8 people turn around. Because Joe is a name that speaks of the common character of humanity. I remember back in 1974 when I first came here, the very first Sunday I was here in July of 74, a little girl walks up to me, and there weren't many people in the church that time. Like there were 45 people at worship. And she said, are you going to do a children's sermon, Pastor Don, like the other pastor used to do? I didn't even know what a children's sermon was back then. And I said, oh, of course. And so I looked around, and they had a coffee table with some styrofoam cups on it. And so I took a styrofoam cup, and I bent it, and I squished it. And I did a little story about Fred. And that's how the whole thing got going. But Fred has become kind of a symbol of the common person. In fact, shortly after I came here, there was a family, Fred and Margaret Johnson. They started coming to church. They enjoyed it. And I wondered why they never joined. And he said, Don, I come every Sunday, and you talk about Fred. You talk about me, and I can't stand it. He never joined. You know, on the female side, the name Helen kind of gets to me because my grandmother was named Helen. And it seems to me every Helen I know is kind of a blue-collar, simple, gentle, humble person who works hard. And so I remember my grandmother she wore these aprons with these pockets, and every day, I don't think she ever took it off. She had every possession she owned in her apron. If you needed a screwdriver or butter, it was always in her apron. And when my mom got sick with cancer, she would get on the bus from Roseland and take it into Glen Ellen and clean the house in her apron. And so that's what I always think of when I think of the word Helen. Anyways, I was talking about Joe a couple minutes ago. I moved years ago right behind Joe. in the house I presently have. And when Joe found out that a minister moved right behind him, he couldn't wait to have me try to convince him to believe in God, because Joe was one of the most enthusiastic atheists I ever met. You know, some people wear religion on their sleeves. He wore his atheism on his sleeve. He just loved it. And I remember once he invited me over for a beer at his house, and he tried like crazy to convince me there wasn't a God. And he waited for me to try to convince him back, and yet I turned the other cheek. I just let him talk. And afterwards I simply said, Joe, I don't care if you believe in God. I just want you to be a good neighbor. And I also went the second mile because I invited him back to my house, and we talked more. Well, a few months went by, and then one day, Joe showed up in church, and he sat in the front row. And he came back the next Sunday and sat in the front row. A month later, he got diagnosed with brain cancer, and he sat in the front row. A month after that, he had major surgery. And after that, he was in a wheelchair for a while. And he had this incredibly not very good-looking Band-Aid that wrapped around his head that no longer had hair. None of you or me would probably go to church looking like that. Joe came to church, and he sat in the front row. And it was the Sunday of our July 4th service. And we used to have little informal debates about whether or not it was polite to clap in church. Some people in the choir thought it was good. Some people said no. Anyway, Len Sislow during the service sang "Proud to be an American." And as soon as Lenny got done, Joe propped himself out of the wheelchair, turned around and faced Lenny, and started to clap. And everybody else started to clap. And everybody else stood up. And since then, we can't stop clapping in church. And I wasn't sure whether we were clapping for Joe, or for Len, or for our country, or for whatever. But somehow, some way, in his presence, God spoke. You know, I don't know what the secret is to world peace or to goodness or the success of our country's future, but the secret lies somewhere inside the heart and the soul of a humble carpenter named Jesus and people like Fred and Helen and Joe, who speak to us in their ordinariness. Amen. If you're able to, please rise for the creed. It's on page 105.